So I want to show you how to make home bread that is rustic and delicious with crust and wonderful flavor. So first I'm going to talk about the yeast, how to make your own yeast, natural yeast. So it's kind of a sourdough, but you can make it not to be too sour actually, because sourdough gets more sour as the yeast ages. So if the yeast you're using it often, it doesn't get to the point of being way too sour. If you like sour, then you keep your yeast to stay much longer, and then it makes the bread more sour. So it's all up to you. So I have here the yeast that I have created, and the way to make it is very, very easy. You take a clean jar, you take whole wheat flour, and it needs to be whole because when you take away some essential nutrients from the wheat, it doesn't let the yeast to develop. So it needs to be whole. I take about 3 heaping tablespoons like that. I put it in a jar, and here it doesn't need measurement. It's up to you how much you want to do. It's just all about the texture that you want to end up with. So I put it in a jar because I want to let it rise. It rises and it becomes like this afterwards. You need to use mineral water that hasn't been treated with Clorox or with any other chemicals. So you cannot use tap water. So I use just spring water that comes naturally from Mother Earth. That's what I'm using, bottled water. So I add into this just enough to make it into a paste. So about 2 tablespoons. And I'll mix it with a clean knife and if I see that it's too runny, the way it is now, it's too runny, I will add a little bit more flour. I mix. What I want to achieve is a texture that is similar with thick yogurt or mayo, mustard, just like this. Now this is ready. Now this, I keep it on the counter with the cap just about covering, but not really covering it tight, because you need oxygen in the jar to continue to feed the flour to create that yeast in it. And to keep oxygen going in, you shouldn't seal the jar. You just put something on top, like a paper or even the cover without sealing it tight, and you're gonna end up with, after a few hours, you're gonna end up with bubbly texture like this. And when it gets to that point, you can seal it, cover it, and put it in the fridge. Every week, you will need to feed it. Feeding it means that the yeast have used all the nutrients and the oxygen inside, and it have completed its action. For the yeast to continue to live, you need to give it more food. So what you will need to do is to add a tablespoon of flour and some water mixed, and until I get that texture like a thick mayo, just like that. This is the texture I want, and just put it like this and let it sit until it bubbles. And when it bubbles, you pop it in the fridge and you're done. Today's bread is gonna be rye bread, flavored like a rye bread. I'm not using rye flour. I'm using bread flour and whole wheat flour. So I have 500 grams of flour here. 1 cup is whole wheat flour and 2 cups is bread flour. And that measured into 500 grams. So into this, I will add 2 teaspoons salt. You can also use only 1.5 teaspoon if you're on a low sodium diet. So this goes in, and I'll mix the flour with this. The rye bread, normally they flavor it with caraway seed, and I grind them to become like this in just a grinder, home grinder. So I add a tablespoon of the caraway seeds in there, and that's optional, as I said. Now, a good dough needs to be high in water quantity, and that's what makes those big bubbles in the dough, and I like that, you know, that airy inner section of the bread. So for 500 grams of flour, which is 3 cups, we put 1.5 cups of water. So the flour is double the water. The water is 50% the amount of the flours in cups, but in weight it's about 70% water to flour. So I'll mix the caraway seed in, and into my water I'm gonna add about 20 grams of my yeast that I have prepared. Heaping amount like this, and it doesn't have to be exact, you will see, like this amount. I'll put it in the water and I'll mix it to dissolve it. And it doesn't have to completely dissolve, but just to make it much easier and pliable in the dough. So if you want your dough to be completely slow to rise and to let it mature, and that's what makes the flavor so much more complex and so much better, you don't use any yeast, outside yeast. This should be enough, and it's gonna make your dough rise. But if you want to quicken the process, you can put 1/4 teaspoon of this rapid yeast, but that's optional. If you want to do it fast, then add it. If not, then you don't have to. So now that I have dissolved the natural yeast in here, I will add the whole thing into the flour. And I'm not gonna even put my hand at this moment. I will just mix to hydrate all the flour with that liquid. Now at this point, see, I didn't even put my hand in it. When I got all the flour hydrated, and it took all the flour became wet, I just cover it with saran wrap and just let it sit for 15 minutes. Okay, we are 15 minutes later. This is how it looks. It doesn't look pretty, but wait, it's gonna get prettier. Now I will scrape whatever on the side here. I will scrape it down to put it with the dough. And this dough we don't need. We just hold it, stretch it, and you stretch it as much as it goes before it trips, and you just fold it. Stretch and fold, stretch and fold, stretch and fold, and just a couple of times, and that's all you need to do. And now you let it sit. So this is something that you need to do while you are at home on a weekend, when you're not outside roaming around. You are at home. Every hour or so you come back. Now see how it got smoother look on it, and it gets smoother and smoother and smoother as you go. So now I will cover it and I'll let it sit. In an hour or so I will come and I'll do the same thing again. I do that all day before I go to bed, as it is covered, I park it in the fridge. Because I don't like my bread too sour. I park it in the fridge, and tomorrow I pull it out, let it come to room temperature, and that's when I heat the oven to bake it. And I'll show you when we get there. To bake a great bread, you need a heavy-duty iron pot or any pot that can retain heat, and it can stand very high heat, because I'm gonna bake it in the highest temperature that my oven can go to. I normally bake this type of bread at 475 degrees. The pot needs to be already hot, so I'm gonna put it in the oven. But before I do that, I take a parchment paper, I crumble it so I can manipulate how it looks and so it sits well in the pot. Because if you don't do that, it tends to pop out and not sit the way I want it. Because I don't want to touch this pot while it's hot after I take it out when I need to put the bread in. So I line the pot with this parchment paper, and the bread is going to be baking on top of it with the lid covered for the first 20 to 25 minutes, because that steam is going to continue to drip upon the bread and cook it well. And then the last 10 minutes, 7 to 10 minutes, I open the lid and I continue baking until I achieve a really nice crust. So my oven just beeped for me, but this pot is still not hot. So let me put this in the oven, make sure it's hot, and I'll show you how we put the bread in it and bake it for that great achieving bread. Now this pot is steaming hot. Make sure you don't touch it with your hands. The parchment paper got brown, which is okay. Now I have the dough have risen here. I'm gonna gingerly just drop it into my hand, just like this. And the top, normally it's drier than the bottom, so I am able to have it in my hand without sticking in my hand. Okay, so here it is. I'm gonna flip it like this right into the pot. Now I'm gonna slice 1, 2, 3, if you want 4, with just a regular blade. Cover it and back into the oven. Now that it is in the oven, don't worry about the bread deflating a little bit when I put it in the pot. It's gonna rise again. That steam and the heat of the oven is gonna make the dough rise again, and it's gonna take its shape. I'm gonna leave it in there covered for about 25 minutes. Then I'm gonna uncover and leave it for 7 more minutes for the top to caramelize and become golden brown, because I like that chard on it at the top. I'll show you. I just got it out of the oven. I picked it up with kind of 2 wooden spoons out of the pot, because the pot is hot and it needs to cool on a rack. So what I do is I just carry it with 2 wooden spoons. I took it out of the pot, put it on a rack so it doesn't steam. But I wanted you to hear how it sounds so hollow, and all the inside is gonna be really airy and big bubbles. I cannot cut it immediately because when it's too hot, it might become like gummy inside. It needs to cool before we cut it through. So you need to be patient.